Welcome to Lead Smarter, Not Harder, your stop for how to stand out as a leader. I'm your host, Jason Davis, and this week we talk about giving feedback, specifically meaningful feedback so you can get better results. I promise you don't want to miss a second of this show. Let's go! All right. Well, today we're here to talk about giving feedback. Probably more specifically, really giving better feedback so you can get better results. I was reading an article from Gallup lately, and it was talking about just what employees, have been looking for, or maybe have been missing, over the pandemic, or just during that time where they may have been more hybrid or remote than they might have been in a previous scenario or situation. And it got into the subject of giving feedback for your employees. And again, what people are looking for, what they may be missing or anything like that. And it had an interesting kind of factoid or fact as a part of that article. Obviously people are looking for feedback. That's why it was brought up in the article. They're wanting meaningful feedback, and that's not what they're getting. So Gallup actually found that around the time that this survey was taken, around 45% of employees say they've gotten feedback from their manager either daily or a few times a week on a regular basis. But only 28% of that group say that they regularly receive meaningful feedback. So that would be feedback that it spurs them to action, gives them, something that they can do to improve upon or do differently, or know that they're doing well, if it's in that case also. So again, 45% of people are saying they regularly get feedback, but only 28% of that group is saying that the feedback is actually meaningful. So it's time being spent between manager and employee, but it's not meaningful time that's going to turn into positive action, essentially is what we're looking for here. So, while the pandemic has increased the demand for feedback or assurance that work is being done right, because we're not seeing it in action as much as we were before. If you were in an office situation, you could see that work taking place. You can see that work in action. Now that you're remote, you might not be able to see everything, but only the outcome. And sometimes it's making those conversations, or it's kind of separating managers and employees from having those intermediary conversations that, kind of help a project maybe go from A to Z, or from start to finish, with some feedback as they're seeing work observed or being done. So, again, we're seeing feedback being given a little less than 50%, but only 28% of people are saying it's actually meaningful stuff that I can do something with. And from the manager's perspective, I get it. I know that giving feedback can be awkward, especially if you're new to it. It's not something you've done before, and it can sometimes be even more awkward if, again, you're not seeing all the action or the work taking place. You're only seeing the outcome. So, here's, a couple of things to think about anyway. It's just, increasing those little touch points that you're having with your employees to make that a little less awkward is going to be helpful. But, I've talked to managers in the past who, even in a, prior scenario where we're in an office, I've talked to managers in the past who feel like they're being too much of a micromanager in some instances when they're providing feedback, or they're afraid of how people are going to react. And that's true. People are going to react in different ways. I think, there are ways to, to timing and things that you have to think about as a leader of when to give that feedback. And there are right ways and wrong ways to do that. And we'll get into that a little bit later in this show. But in fact, as a manager, it's part of your job. It may not have been in the job description even, but part of your job is to give your employees meaningful feedback so that they can take that and understand what they need to do differently or what they're doing well, and how to improve what they're doing based on that feedback. So, like I said, there's a right way to do that. There's a wrong way to do that. There's probably many right ways to do that. There are many wrong ways to do that as well. But we're going to talk about a right way, or a good way that I've experienced anyway in my past, of how to give meaningful feedback to your employees. So I talked about it a little bit earlier. We know managers are giving that feedback, but it's just not hitting home. It's not making the impact that we want. It's not getting the impact that the employee is looking for, or the kind of feedback that the employees are looking for. So, we talked about it earlier. Less than 50% of workers are actually getting regular feedback. Just a little bit below that, but again, it's not meaningful. It's only meaningful for about 28% of that group. So, the majority of people, you could just consider the whole landscape. The majority of people out there in the landscape, one, are not getting any feedback at all. And two, it's certainly not meaningful if they are getting it. So I think those are some pretty fair assumptions, obviously not 100%, but some pretty fair assumptions based upon what we're seeing. Now, the result of that is you're going to have employees that continue to struggle. They don't feel like they have support that they need from their leaders or from their peers or from other people in the organization. They're going to continue to miss their goals and not understand why or be unable to figure out why, because they're not getting that meaningful feedback or that info on what is going wrong. And eventually that leads to, burnout. It leads people to, I'm never going to be successful here if they can't find a way to get better on their own. And not everybody can do that. That's why feedback in this instance is truly very, very critical. And why I wanted to spend some time talking to you all about it, going through it, and hopefully giving you a model that you all can use anyway to give better feedback for your employees. So, instead of letting, this continue to happen, this meaningless feedback continue to happen, we're going to talk about giving better feedback to your employees to get better results. So, as we dive into that, let's talk about, there's two main types of feedback. One is redirecting feedback. And this is probably the most common, one that you might be more familiar with or think of most. Redirecting feedback is where we see something that is incorrect or is going the wrong way, and we need to course correct or redirect the employee. The second is reinforcing feedback. This is when something goes well or as planned, or, got a customer compliment or something like that. We want to make sure we reinforce when people do a good job as well. We want to let them know that they're doing something right. They followed a process, they won a customer, closed a sale, whatever. That reinforcing feedback, again, gives them a little bit of meaningful feedback to let them know, hey, I'm doing this and I'm doing it right. And it gives them just that little bit of pump up to say, all right, I can keep doing this and keep going. Between these two types, the redirecting feedback and the reinforcing feedback, it's really critical to create a good balance between the two so that you're not always giving one over the other or one more than the other. You don't want to always seem like you're telling your employees to do something different or telling them what they're doing wrong. And you don't always, just want to give them the good news or the good things that they're doing. You want to make sure to bring in a good blend of, hey, here are things that are going right. Here are things that could use a little bit of redirection, and let's talk about that. So it's critical to think about, all right, how am I going to give both of these so that my employees can really grow and not just feel like I'm kind of, beating them over the head with something all the time, or not just patting them on the back all the time. There's got to be a good blend. They are both absolutely essential. So, I mentioned earlier that there is a right way to give feedback and there's a wrong way to give feedback. There's probably lots of different ways to do this, lots of different right ways, lots of different wrong ways, and it's easy to do, and it's easy to come off the wrong way as well. So I would say it's a lot easier to give feedback poorly than it is to give feedback in a way that people would appreciate. That's why I think when people need to give more of that redirective feedback, I really feel like they start to get a little bit of fear around how somebody might react, and then find ways to just not give that feedback or do it in a passive way or a more passive way that puts it in that space where it's meaningless, right? It's not meaningful feedback that employee can really benefit from or improve from, or to say, hey, I'm going to do this better because I have a new plan or I have a different idea based on how to do it. So, there's a lot to kind of consider there, but in my experience, the best feedback is specific, it is timely, and it offers an element of redirection or some kind of alternative if, again, we need that, right? If we're reinforcing, then we don't necessarily need that. But if we need somebody to do something different, it helps to either ask them to kind of explain what should be done differently, or to provide that if they don't have that knowledge, if they don't have that level of knowledge. So it's important, like I said, be specific in your feedback, be timely. Don't wait a week. Don't wait 2 weeks to give feedback. Be timely. Do it as close to the event as you can get. And make sure to offer some kind of element or some kind of suggestion on what to do differently next time. So luckily, from a feedback perspective, there's a really good model that we can follow. The Center for Creative Leadership developed this model some time ago. I'll make sure to include some info in the show notes, as well as a link to an infographic or something like that as well. That's helpful. But the Center for Creative Leadership created a model called the Situation Behavior Impact Model, or SBI for short. So again, it's Situation Behavior Impact. SBI is the acronym, because you got to have an acronym for everything, right? So let's break the model down a little bit, piece by piece. So first of all, you've got S, which is your situation. This is where you're providing details around the situation that necessitated the feedback you're looking to give in the first place. It could be an event, something that happened during a meeting, something that happened during a call, whatever that is. It's just, the situation. So we need to kind of, if you're envisioning filling out a form or a template, right? Like, what is the situation? Well, what is the setting or the scenario in which all this occurred, right? So whatever it is, you want to make sure you're being very specific about the details so your employees can remember the situation that you're talking about. So bringing in, like specific details that help them get a visual, paint a picture, help me understand exactly the situation and the scenario that you're giving me feedback about, so that I can kind of recall that in my mind, right? So this may even sound something like, hey, Alex, this morning when you were talking with Mr. Smith about picking up his car. See, okay, so there's two things there, right? It's specific, talked about, who it was and the person they were talking to and exactly the situation or what they were doing, right? Talking with Mr. Smith about picking up his car. It's timely, right? So the event or the situation or this thing happened just this morning, and I'm already taking action on it. I didn't wait a week. I didn't wait a day. I'm already taking action on it. So kind of thinking about it in those critical things that I mentioned earlier. Is it timely? Is it specific? And is it redirecting? We've already hit two of them. So think about that from the situation standpoint. So we want to make sure that we're being specific, painting a picture. They can kind of put that in their mind so they know what exactly we're talking about as a leader. Okay, so that's the situation. The B in this acronym stands for behavior. And this is the space where you talk about the behavior that was observed. So, these are the actions that were taken, the words that were used, or other things that the employee did or didn't do in the scenario. That is the reason for the feedback, right? So we want to make sure that, it's factual. We want to make sure it's things that we observed as the manager or that we're able to see in some respect, right? So if you heard it take place on the call, or if you saw the action take place, or you can see it in a documentation or see it in documentation or notes or something like that, you want to be specific about that and keep it factual. You don't ever want to assume or, that something did or didn't happen. Keep it exactly to what you know happened and, what you can see or what you heard, right? So, this might sound like something like, you didn't document your conversation with the customer once you were off the phone. So again, we've got, hey, Alex, this morning when you were talking with Mr. Smith about picking up his car, you didn't document your conversation with the customer once you were off the phone. So we've talked about the situation, we talked about the behavior that took place now, and now we want to get into what is the impact, right? So Another critical component of this is explaining to your employees the why, right? Why am I giving you this feedback? Well, I'm giving it to you because the impact of your behavior caused this, right? So we want to say the impact of your behavior might cause or will cause or caused this to take place. So this, and this is where you're getting into the business impact, right? What's the business impact to this situation and to this specific behavior? There could be a positive or a negative impact, right? And that's back to, is this redirecting or reinforcing feedback? But it's important as the manager, you need to know what that impact is so that you can articulate it. Because that's where the meaningful piece of the feedback comes in, right? Why do I care about impacting this metric as an employee? I need to know what is happening to the business if I do or don't do this thing, right? So it's important to give that impact. How can you let them know what that is? Like I said, make sure you can tie it back to metrics that's important to the employee, their role, and things that they care about, right? They care about things like customer satisfaction. They care about things like call times or, close times or things like that. Things that are personally meaningful to that individual. They may not care as much that, the company may not make as much money. And that's being very general. But, it's that is so much further away from the employee and what they do day to day than, let's say, customer satisfaction or shorter call times and things like that. So, again, be meaningful to the employee. That's where you get to meaningful feedback, right? So, keep it connected to important metrics that the employees care about and are regularly aware of, right? So, again, if your employees are at a level where they're directly impacting money coming into the organization or not, then yeah, you can use that as an example. But again, sometimes you got a lot of employees that just aren't a part of that. And it takes other things to convince them that, hey, I need to do something a little bit differently, right? Now, I want to make sure that, we're thinking about, this is not a time to admonish people. We simply just want to let them know if you're in redirecting feedback. Sorry, if you're in redirecting feedback, this is not a time to admonish people. We're simply just wanting to let people know how that behavior impacts the business and why it's important to redirect if it's going to be a negative impact. Right? That's all we're letting them know. We're just trying to inform them of that. So let's, try to think of it that way. And that might help remove some of the fear about, people reacting in a negative way. I think that fear might always exist, but if you kind of follow this model, follow this template, it takes a little bit of that out because you're speaking directly to facts. And at the end of the day, you're just trying to help. You're just trying to be helpful, right? So, and if you're giving the right balance of feedback between redirecting and reinforcing, it's also going to take some of that awkwardness out because you're not always only giving one form or the other. You're mixing that up. You're giving people a balance of feedback that says, hey, you're doing a great job at this. You might be able to do a little bit better at this if you do this. And that's really where we want to be and moving more into that kind of space, right? So don't always do one or the other because that's going to really impede your ability to give meaningful feedback in this case. So we can kind of, wrap this one up as well. So thinking about impact, that might sound like, so in this case, let's tie all this together anyway. So, hey, Alex, this morning when you were talking with Mr. Smith about picking up his car, you didn't document your conversation with the customer once you were off the phone. Then the customer called back in and had to repeat all of their information again to get support. And they became very frustrated at the situation because they just called and gave the entire story to someone else. And because that person didn't document, the next person that took the call didn't know, had to ask all the questions again, right? So we see this a lot in authentication or things like that when you're trying to just validate who the customer is or who they are. But this happens in scenarios, contact centers, call centers, stuff like that, where people call in and maybe they call back before we've even had a chance to finish documenting, or just busy and maybe we forget or just fail to document for some reason or another, right? It wasn't intentional. or maybe this person just doesn't know that when they need to document immediately after the call or something like that. So, but again, so the impact here is, there's a potential hit in customer service, which we know impacts customer retention, right? So, there could be a customer service impact as a result of this person calling back in and then getting very frustrated at being asked the same exact questions all over again. So that's how you can get into, letting people know, all right, here's the impact to the business, and in a way that it might be meaningful to them. So, they can start thinking about that, in their day-to-day work and the things that they're doing and say, all right, maybe I need to change my process a little bit, or the things that I'm doing to make sure I remember to do X, Y, and Z specifically all the time. So again, it just makes people think a little bit differently. So that's the model there, the SBI, situation, behavior, impact. I do want to deviate a little bit, take a slight diversion from the Center for Creative Leadership model. So if you're in a situation where you're giving redirective feedback or redirecting feedback, so that, again, something has gone wrong or not gone the way that we wanted it to go, and we need to let somebody know that something needs to happen different, you can give them that something different. In this case, you can also give them an alternative. Because again, it may be a newer employee, or sometimes people just don't know things sometimes, or don't know that things are a process or the next step. So this is where I add in an A to the model. So SBIA, situation, behavior, impact. A is alternative. So thinking about the alternative, or, what the right action would be to take next time. So again, this makes sense for redirecting feedback. So you're going to give them the situation, you're going to be specific, you're going to be timely, you're going to give them the behavior that you observed, you're going to talk about the impact to the business, and then you're going to give them an alternative suggestion, something that they can try differently next time, or think about differently next time, to see if it helps, to see if it makes it better. So that in our scenario that we've been playing out, that alternative suggestion or the alternative approach might be, make sure to always document your conversations immediately after the call. So very simple, very clear. You might even ask your employee if you want, hey, what might be a good alternative or a good approach for you to start taking in these scenarios to make sure that you always remember, right? And maybe have them articulate it back. That's fine too. I just think it helps to create that alternative view, so that if they don't know and they're afraid to ask why or how, you're giving that to them, or you're giving them a platform to give you information if you want to ask them, hey, what can you do differently here next time? That's a perfectly acceptable way to go about it also. But I think that's what takes feedback to the next level, is when you can start to articulate what that alternative is. And that's where you start to get meaningful with your feedback. Remember, we're giving feedback a little less than 50%. We need more than that. But we need the feedback to be meaningful, because you're spending time giving that feedback. You're taking time from your employees, and you might be taking time away from the business in some way. It's all important to do, but it needs to be effective. There needs to be a return on that, right? It needs to be meaningful. The employee needs to feel like what they're hearing from their manager is meaningful feedback, that I can do something with this. Not that I'm just could do a better job. So we need to take that to the next level. So really thinking about the model, SBIA, situation, behavior, impact, with an alternative. It's super simple. It's easy to remember. Again, thanks to the Center for Creative Leadership for putting this model together. I'll throw some resources in the show notes. Again, but it takes some of the awkwardness out of your delivery, out of giving that feedback, and it will help you make feedback meaningful. It will mean something to your employees. I promise. It's the kind of feedback that people can actually use to improve their performance. So I hope you've learned a new good model this week that you can use to give your employees feedback. I've used this several times in my career and my roles as a leader. I've even used it with peers. I've used it during job interviews. If you think about it, it's a great way to answer behavioral interview questions as well. There are lots of great uses for this SBI model, if you want to include the A for alternative as well. But I encourage you, try it out, write it down on a piece of paper if you've got to, write it out, practice it with a peer. But, work on the model. I promise you will find value, and your employees will find that they're getting meaningful feedback from you when you're putting it in this format. So thanks for listening. I hope you have a great week. Talk to you later.